everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Can you just put your green tick up for me, if you can hear me? Okay, good. Well, thank you for coming along today. I have had an email from a few participants that have struggled logging in today, so I'm going to deal with them whilst our presenter starts their presentation. So, as usual, just sure that you've got all your other programs closed down in the background so you can just take part for the full kind of 45 minutes to an hour for today. So today's webinar is all about information and research. So hopefully you have had time to go through Module 4 online and found it useful and informative for you guys. So our presenter today is David Morris. So he is NUS's NSS Projects Officer. So he's going to be speaking about a few different topics today, things like NSS and the Student Engagement Survey and learner analytics and things like that. So it's a really interesting session today. As usual, if you have any comments throughout the way, just put in the comments box and myself and David will keep an eye on it, answer any questions and things like that. And we'll also stay around for questions at the very end. Okay, so I will hand over to David, so just give me 1 second.
Hello, can you hear me now? I think I accidentally clicked mute. There we go. I thought I'd done something wrong. Webinar, Amelia asked me to put in a sort of a wide range of things related to surveys, information, research. So it's a bit of a smorgasbord, if you like, of different things. But we're scheduled in for an hour. It won't take that long. There's no way it'll take that long. And because I'm not sure on your existing kind of like knowledge bank in relation to these issues, I'm gonna be a sort of a automation, sort of a bit death by PowerPoint. But please, if you do have any questions at all as we go through, please do just ask them in the comments box, and I will then endeavour to answer them the best I can. If there's anything I don't cover, if there's anything that's unclear, or if there's anything you'd like me to just expand on a little bit or explore a bit more, or anything you'd like to challenge me on what I've said, then please put it in the box, and we can have a little back and forth and discussion about various bits as we go. So I haven't really booked in specific discussion time, but just want to give you the opportunities to bring up things and go through it bit by bit. We're going to, like Amelia said, we're going to cover the National Student Survey, the student evaluations of teaching or module evaluation questionnaires, as they're sometimes known, the UK Engagement Survey, which is a relatively new innovation in UK higher education, and I'm also going to cover at the end, sort of as an add-on, the exciting new world of learner analytics, which is next year is going to open up some really interesting doors for higher education in Britain, and it's going to be a fast emerging area which you may not have come across before unless you work in a select few institutions who are sort of pioneering this area. So that's not really about surveys, but it will hopefully have an impact on your profession as a student engagement practitioners. Students, just off sort of generally before we dig into the specific surveys, is a controversial and a contested kind of area in sort of the UK Academy. It's a practice now that's been going on for probably about 20 to 30 years. It's something that we've kind of, like many things in UK higher education, originated in America and has sort of come over here and has really taken off in the last 10 years in the introduction of the NSS. Broadly, it's for and against surveys do fit into sort of surveys are good and surveys are bad discussions. Those who argue that surveys are good, which would generally include myself, is that surveys provide democratic access to students and give them a clear, easy opportunity to provide comment to their teachers in some way, depending on the particular student instrument. That surveys have been very important in driving evidence-based enhancement throughout the higher education sector. That it's important to understand what students think of their education because students do know what a good education looks like, and that surveys have been particularly effective in identifying particular issues or concerns of particular demographics of students. That often committee-based feedback, such as student representatives, doesn't do. Student representatives tend to be overwhelmingly from sort of traditional backgrounds, and it's difficult to represent a diversity of views just through student representatives alone. And surveys can do that and allow you to break down data. But there are many who argue that surveys in higher education, particularly NSS, but also module quiz, that they have been detrimental to education. That they're fundamentally consumerist, and that it's led to education modelling a sort of service provision model. Some equivalent of how would you rate your experience, and it's a fundamentally passive method of engagement because surveys, at least in relation, only provide are only a student providing their feedback to their lecturer and don't allow for a two-way conversation unless you initiate it. And he argued that surveys, particularly the NSS, but also module evaluation questionnaires, are used to pressurise and manage teaching staff, and that undue pressure is put on a lot of staff who are forced to focus on driving up their survey results rather than actually improving the quality of their teaching. Some would argue that students don't know what a good or effective education looks like, and that the satisfaction of students is in no way connected to their learning, and that it's inappropriate to box education into discrete categories as surveys require, unless you do them through free text. I have forgotten. What was it? It's left me back to me. I will bring it up. But yeah, so there are broadly two schools of thought on surveys. They're not without problems. And one argument, particularly against surveys, that has been recently found, particularly in analysis of module evaluation surveys, is that they respond with their own prejudices and biases. So some research found that women teachers regularly are rated lower than men teachers on surveys due to sort of inherent biases and prejudices of students, and therefore that there is something very problematic about just relying on raw sort of instinctive student evaluations of particularly of teachers, as opposed to teaching, because they tend to bring with them prejudices and sort of other problematic things. So, without doubt, probably the most controversial of all surveys in UK higher education is the National Student Survey. I'm sure many of you are probably already aware and familiar with the NSS. I'm not sure how much you each sort of use it on a regular basis and how familiar you all are. So I'm going to go through the basics and then go into some more detail about a few things and just try and make sure I cover everything. So just the real basics of the NSS. It's open to all final year undergraduates in the UK. Effectively, it was originally really compulsory for publicly funded higher education institutions in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Because of its prominence now, all higher education institutions in Scotland also opt in. It's also open to further, students studying higher education courses in further education colleges. It's been running since 2005. Over 400,000 participants. It's the third largest survey of any kind in the UK. It's an absolutely massive data set. It's initially 22 questions in the core survey and moved up to 23 questions when a question was added about students' unions in 2012. And it's funded by the Higher Education Funding Council for England on behalf of all the funding councils and run by the very famous polling company Ipsos Mori. The end was originally set up for this is a public information just after the introduction of top-up fees in England, the £3,000 top-up fees that were issued by Tony Blair's government. The vote was 2004, I believe, with the original aim of providing being an enhancement or an engagement instrument, but as being a means of public information for prospective students to be able to decide which were the best and worst courses and which they would like to go on, and sort of for that indirectly to drive up competence and quality in the sector. Since its introduction, there's been particularly a big piece of research that was done a few years ago by FKI that actually shows that the details of survey results and public information do not really influence students' choices when it comes to choosing universities. That students are not rational decision makers who make decisions based on complete evaluation of data, and so the role of a survey in public information is definitely in providing public information for choice. Is definitely contestable. But since the survey has been introduced, it has, and you're probably familiar with this, been extensively used internally by institutions, particularly in liaison with their students' unions, for identifying areas for enhancement in academic practice, particularly in the areas of assessment and feedback and course organisation and management. And certainly from NUS's point of view, we think that's largely a positive thing. As you can see here, these are the 23 questions. First four about teaching, then some about, actually this is slightly, apologies, this is slightly wrong. So questions 5 to 9 are on assessment feedback, and questions 10 to 12 are on academic support, that's the RAD. Organisation management, learning resources, which is library, IT, and the other one, and specialist facilities. Personal development, which is sort of related to mobility and careers, the questions were a bit overall satisfaction and the students' union. Institutions can add optional banks of questions, so there are some preset sets of questions, about 4 or 5 questions that institutions can opt into on top of the core survey. This isn't public information, but institutions do opt into it, particularly if you have lots of NHS students. There are particular questions on NHS courses. There are 2 boxes for positive and negative free text comments, which sometimes could be some of the richest and most valuable data off the survey. All areas of the survey, all the sort of banks of the survey, have all gone up in scores since the introduction of the survey in 2005, and overall satisfaction rated is very high. My personal opinion is that overall satisfaction question 22, which is from the headline score, is a very poor indicator of what students think about their course, because the way the question is worded, there's a phenomenon in behavioural psychology known as what you see is all there is, or also sometimes expressed as when people have a heuristic about how they answer survey questions, which is essentially a mental shortcut, that when presented with a difficult question, people will answer a similar question that is easier to answer. So if students, for example, are asked, overall, are you satisfied with your course? That's quite a specific thing to answer. Generally, the shortcut to people's brains is actually asking them, have you had a good time at university? And so when students give that a high score, generally means that they've had a good time at university. It doesn't necessarily mean that they thought their course was great, but broadly, most students, I think, have a good time at university. Sometimes independently of whether the course was any good. And so I think, in spite of the high scores that most institutes score on overall satisfaction, question 22, you really get the most from the data when you dig into the other banks, which give you more specific indicators of what students are really thinking of their course. The lowest scores, by quite a considerable margin, are regularly in all institutions are for assessment feedback, and many students on the number of courses in many institutions are consistently not happy with the quality of assessment feedback on their courses, and this is still a real big problem for the sector, even though scores have been improving since the survey was introduced. The second lowest scores are typically for organisation and management, particularly in more modern sort of post-92, less research-intensive institutions. Academic support is then the third lowest. The highest scores tend to go to actually teaching. The teaching bank asks students about the quality of their staff. And generally, students seem to find their lecturers fairly engaging and interesting, but not necessarily their assessment and feedback, their support, or the course organisation and management on the whole. This varies greatly between courses and between departments and institutions. Just a few additional important points about the survey. The survey gets a very, very high response rate over nationally of about 75 or so percent. And in many institutions, the response rate is over 80%. So it's a very comprehensive sample and it's big data. This is to Ipsos's very persistent survey gathering methods. There are 3 stages. Students are invited to complete the survey online. If they don't specifically specify that they would like to opt out of the survey, they will be chased up by telephone and eventually by post, which is what gets very high scores. A 50% response rate is required in all subcategories of data. So, for example, for all courses, and that has to be at least 23 individual responses in order for the data to be made public, in order to protect the anonymity of respondents. In almost all cases, that 50% threshold is met, at least on an institution-wide basis. The survey is very, very successful in getting a large sample. The cycle of the survey, so we're just coming to the end of the response period now. I think the survey closes this week, possibly actually on Friday. And this month the survey is promoted in August. In my opinion, the crucial period for the survey is really between August and December, which is when institutions form action plans based on the results. This is an ideal time for student representatives and educators to sit down and discuss collectively what we're going to do about their NSS results and the kind of actions that will be taken as a result. This is where some of the most successful student engagement in youth higher education takes place, reviewing and thinking about results and making action plans, not just making plans exclusively based on improving results, but using the results as a basis to start a conversation that can go into much more depth around issues that students are raising through the survey. And there's great leverage for students because of the survey, because the data is public and institutions really have a stick, as it were, to make sure that they do their best in terms of enhancing practice. You can quite easily get hold of results if you don't already know how to get hold of NSS results. You don't have access to them. All institutions and students' unions have a login, and there will be someone responsible at an institution and the students' union for getting the login to the Texuna Tech website, which is the company who administer getting the data out to institutions. Find who in your institution is sort of the NSS contact who will have those login details and can help you and can access the data. If you just want to quickly access a small sample of the data, you can go to Unistats, which is the government's public information site, which contains select bits of data that is made public as part of the government's sort of public information drive. But the internal results site, nss.texunatech.com, is the best place to get full comprehensive data, and you can get tons and tons of spreadsheets. If you would like more information on how to go about accessing that data and making sense of it, if you've never done it before, get in touch with Amelia this webinar, because we, NUS, we've produced a booklet, a booklet, a sort of step-by-step guide on how to easily access the data through the Texuna Tech website. So if you've never done that before, but you'd like to start doing it, we're not going to cover that directly in this webinar, but we have got a booklet which we can give to you, and you can get in touch with me if you need any help in accessing the data and making sense of it. The slightly idiosyncratic title of this slide, I took it out of a different presentation. This is a sort of SWOT diagram of the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that the NSS presents, I think, to the sector. It's like all surveys, is the most contestable of all surveys, and some of these issues are to the ones on the earlier list at the start of this survey. At the start of this presentation, sorry. It's looked at primarily from a students' union perspective. You see basically, to really utilise the power of the National Student Survey, I think it's really important to have an active understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of the survey, because particularly to some academics and to some teachers, the survey carries only a limited degree of legitimacy, and to not address those concerns about the survey's legitimacy can blunt any efforts to enhance courses based on the survey's results. And so one has to sort of show an awareness of the limitations of what the survey tells one, so that, you know, some of the weaknesses of the survey, such as satisfaction, is not the same as a quality education. A common criticism assesses that satisfaction is just the gap between your expectation and your experience. So a student satisfaction is entirely based on what they were expecting, and not an objective measure of whether quality education is actually any good. Some argue that benchmarking and ranking institutions by the NSS is inappropriate, because education is not a competition. And one very problem about the NSS is that it is a survey with multiple, what we would call multiple units of analysis. When students are evaluating their entire course, over the course of a degree program, a student might have had this applies to my experience, it might apply to yours. It might experience a wide variety of teaching quality in the various categories, because most courses are taught in modular form with different teachers, different structures, and students will typically find that some work and some don't. And the NSS asks students to evaluate kind of all that on average, which is very problematic from a sort of statistical sense, because it's hard to judge what exactly they're evaluating. So the multiple units of analysis problem is definitely an issue with the NSS, and means that the data can only tell you so much about where efforts to enhance education should happen. I'll come back onto when we get onto module evaluation questionnaires, which is useful because they have a single unit of analysis, which is usually one module, one teacher, and it's very clear what you're measuring, and therefore it's very clear what you need to do in order to try and make improvements. And so it's not so clear. This is quite an interesting survey and something to bear in mind if you're ever using the NSS to drive enhancement in some way. UCU, the University and College Union of University and College Teachers, that 70% of their members didn't believe that the NSS had a positive impact on the relationship between staff and their institutions, which suggests that staff are very unhappy about the way NSS is used to manage teaching staff. 60% don't believe that the NSS has had a positive impact on the relationship between staff and students. And 55% didn't believe that the NSS has had a positive impact on the learning experience. One common criticism, despite all I previously said, the effects of the NSS on assessment and feedback, and the improvements in scores, some staff argue that doesn't necessarily mean assessment and feedback in higher education has got any better. It just means that institutions become better at finding ways to do assessment feedback that make students happier, which are not necessarily the same things. And one common response to poor NSS feedback scores is to introduce, for example, 3-week turnaround times on assessment feedback. It has often put a lot of pressure on academic staff who, in some cases, are already very much overworked, and it lowers their morale in trying to get feedback turned around so quickly, perhaps isn't tackling the real cause of the problem. So, this is not without controversy. Here's some quotes, some interesting quotes that sort of just provocatively make you think about what the NSS means in UK higher education. The top one is from a researcher called Camille Candigo-Howson, who was at King's College London, is professor of research in higher education, who makes, I think, a very good point that institutions working to make scores go up on surveys is the same as studying just for what is on exams, just to get good grades, which is a common criticism of modern-day students and the modern-day school system, and it's something to bear in mind if you're ever working on the NSS. One sort of polemic against the NSS described it as about as scientifically useful as TripAdvisor is for travellers, which I think is quite actually a good description of the NSS, because TripAdvisor is useful, but it doesn't give you the full picture. TripAdvisor points you in the right direction, but you need to do your own research in order to know whether it's really good or not. And the same would apply to NSS. It points you in the right direction, but you really need to do further investigation in order to really understand the use that you're looking at. So it's actually quite a good, useful description. Yeah, all wrong, but some are useful. All data, all attempts to quantify, particularly education, will always have a problem, but the does have its uses. And what I'd say from an NUS point of view is that a common sort of quote using liberation campaigning is that nothing about us without us is for us. And from a student's point of view, say that the NSS without the input of students, without engaging students and student union representatives in actions to be taken as a result of it, is not for students. The survey has far greater legitimacy when the actions taken as a result of its results are done alongside students through effective engagement and representation. And from NUS's point of view, from our point of view, that's really, really important. Just looking to the future, the NSS is under review and is going to change in 2017. I've included a link at the end of this presentation to the review that was conducted a year ago, that had commissioned to sort of look for an improving and changing the survey. There'll be the review has recommended that there will be new questions added to the survey around collaborative learning, student voice, and academic challenge. Student voice is particularly interesting for student engagement practitioners. There'll be questions asking students whether they believe that academics have acted upon their feedback, about whether the student voice is taken seriously or not. Those are going to be really interesting when that data comes out. Some questions will be removed where they've been superfluous. It'll be a slightly longer survey. The piloting is currently taking place now, but the new survey won't be introduced for a couple of years. Really interesting, and the full review of the NSS report is a really interesting read if you really want to sort of get to grips with some of the debates for and against the NSS and the way it's been used in positive and negative ways. Right. Any questions on the NSS at this stage? I'm just going to take a sip. That's the largest part of this. The next bits are a little bit shorter. Okay. So we come to student evaluations of teaching, or also known as modular evaluation questionnaires. They may even have slightly different names in some institutions. This is very short, but I've got on this, but that's quite interesting for student engagement practitioners. So SEQs, student evaluations of teaching, or MEQs, modular evaluation questionnaires, or SEEQs, student evaluations of educational quality. They evaluate specific modules, or even more ideally, a specific teacher. So this is coming back to what I was mentioning earlier about serving a very clear unit of analysis. In the NSS, there are multiple units of analysis, which make it unclear, as tend to average out their experience, which tends to mean that NSS scores average out and regress, what's called regression to the mean in statistics. SE can be far more useful because they're very specific. They come in many different forms, many different layouts with different types of questions, and many institutions have their own, which they design. Some departments, some teachers write their own surveys and hand it out to their students. But properly, there has been SETs, modular evaluation questionnaires, were the first types of student survey that were introduced into higher education, I think originally in America in about the 1970s, 1980s. And they were controversial then, they are still controversial now. And as a result, there has been a huge amount of research done on identifying what the statistically robust value of student evaluations of teaching questionnaires are, and when they're valuable and when they are not. And as a result, what has been found is that with the right survey instrument, student evaluations of teaching are valid, reliable, robust, and an excellent proxy for measuring teaching quality and teaching effectiveness, and can give really good insight into whether teaching is actually working or not, much better than something like the NSS can. And as a result, I think they're kind of slightly underused by student engagement practitioners in the UK and need to be looked at more. A lot of this research has been conducted by an American called Professor Herb Marsh, who is works at least the time between Oxford and the University of Western Sydney. But done loads of research into these questionnaires and found them to be, if done properly, really useful, really effective. What that requires is using a survey instrument which Professor Marsh himself has designed, and I would recommend, if you're looking into model evaluations or student evaluations of educational quality, that you look at Marsh and look about introducing his survey instrument for module evaluations, because it's a really powerful way. Used properly, can be a really powerful way of getting educational quality, and a good way of in students. Quick. The final type of survey that I'm going to explore a bit and introduce you to is our what we call engagement surveys. So the NSSE, the NSE as it's typically, which is the North American Survey of Student Engagement, and the recently introduced UKES, or UK Engagement Survey, which has been piloted by the HA for the last couple of years. So, on the vast majority of questions ask students to evaluate the quality of the provision that they are being provided. So it will be the questions are along the lines of staff good or explaining things, or delivery has been good, or feedback on my work has been timely, or feedback on my work has been detailed or helpful. So the emphasis of these questions is that they ask students for their perception of what is being given to them, their teachers or by their institution. Engagement surveys ask students to assess their own behaviour in their education. So asking them to assess how many hours they've done on written assignments, how much time, whether they've had to complex problems or use numeracy skills or various other things like that. And they are what has been found in the research is that this is a far better proxy of teaching quality and effectiveness than student satisfaction scores. It's the quality of education, quality of higher education is fundamentally about whether students are engaged in what's sometimes called educationally effective tasks. And engagement says ask students to consider whether they have engaged in educationally effective tasks, and so they are really good and really effective. They are far more popular in America and Canada and Australia and New Zealand than they are in the UK, and we've never had a nationwide one, whereas the NSSE in America is filled in by about 500,000 students every year. It's asked students not just in their final year, but across all years, and is a very popular enhancement tool in American colleges. So just to give you an idea, here's some questions taken from the NSSE, generally along these lines. So during the current school year, how often have you done the following? Questions have contributed to course discussions, come to class without completing reading assignments, attended an art exhibit, play or other art performance, worked with other students on course projects or assignments. So data isn't made public, it's not benchmarkable, but it does give institutions a far richer sense of what their students are doing and whether they're engaging in their studies effectively, and whether institutions are doing enough to engage their in the kind of activities that will make them learn. I think that's incredibly valuable and something that we need more of in UK higher education. Here's more from the NSSE. Just skipped ahead by accident. There's a section here about career plans, in interaction with teachers, faculty members, which we know is really important for really important for a learning game. How much does your course emphasise different things? And there are some bits about to what extent have your teachers done things, but the vast majority is asking students to evaluate their own behaviour. Reliable if they record people's behaviours and not their attitudes, because by asking questions about attitudes you inherently frame and bias the subject. Behaviours are more objective and so they're easier to measure, but a lot of research has been done to show that people are very bad at reporting their own behaviour. For example, a survey was done outside of Tesco where they asked shoppers to how much of sort of certain healthy foods that they were going to buy entering the store, and then they would watch the shoppers as they left the store and see how much food they had actually bought, and it tends to be a lot less than they said they would. So they're really bad at reporting their behaviour of their own intentions. Read a variety of questions and topics, but the data is not easily benchmarkable. One problem in American higher education, at least, is because there isn't an equivalent of the SS, a sort of a national label influence survey, then it doesn't perform that function, is that whilst American institutions have a great amount of data that can be useful for enhancement, there is some research to show that only in limited cases do they actually act on it, because there isn't enough of a stick to make them act on it. There's not the threat of sort of, bad and leave tables. Now, this is a much more complex debate than that, but there is there is a slight problem there in that the lack of benchmarkableness sometimes perhaps loses the incentive for institutions to improve. But at the end, like I've already said, that the kind of questions asked on the NESI are much too proxy for effective learning and for effective education, and therefore is really valuable. And so it is very much welcomed that the Higher Education Academy has piloted for 2 years now a UK engagement survey, which is based on and borrows from NESI quite a bit shorter, to which a number of institutions have opted in. If your institution has not opted into this survey, I would really try and encourage your institution to do so. I think it would be of great value to both universities and students' unions. And the UCAS asks questions on subjects such as higher order learning, collaborative learning, staff-student interaction, course challenge, reflective learning, time on task. These are all variables that are proven to influence educational outcomes far more than some of the things that are asked on the NSS. So just to give you an example of some of the things that are being asked, there's questions, for example, about staff-student partnerships, which is really interesting from a student engagement point of view, such as whether students have felt like they're part of a joint community of staff and students, whether they've worked with staff to make improvements to their course. This is really, if more institutions get this kind of data, it'll be really, really rich and interesting. There's questions on skills development in a much more detailed sense than there is on the NSS. The results, the pilot, this gives us a sense there's a great deal of variation between subjects. What's interesting is that most students say that they do a great deal in their education of doing things such as applying facts or theories and learning about research methods, analysing ideas, but a lot less of exploring their own questions, formulating their own questions, and creating their own knowledge, which is really interesting, particularly if you work in a research-intensive institution. Those kind of institutions claim to do a lot of that, but there's actually not as much of it. Students don't believe there's as much of it going on as some institutions do. Results from the pilot. There's data here about the extent to which students have talked about their career. A lot of students have not talked about their career at all, which is interesting given the emphasis on employability currently in higher education. Changes to work in response to feedback was probably one of the most important proxies for learning that you could probably think of, and yet that is one of the things that goes on less often according to the current UCAS results, and that's also quite concerning and kind of corroborates with what the NSS tells us about assessment feedback. So there's lots of interesting data coming out of the UCAS already, even though it's only had 2 pilots in about 20 institutions. I would really encourage you to try and encourage your institutions to opt into this survey and to take part of it, because it will be incredibly useful. Right, so that's it on surveys. If you have any questions on those, please do put them in the comments box. This is actually taking a little longer than I thought, so we might actually finish at the hour. We're going to finish very quickly on something that Amelia asked me to talk to you about, which is very new and will be probably that you won't be familiar with, which is learning analytics. This is a rapidly sort of expanding area and will be really interesting for student engagement practitioners. learning analytics. This will not make any sense probably until I visualize it in the next slides, but learning analytics is about using big data to understand and improve students' learning and engagement. Students are very data-rich resources, and institutions are increasingly finding that as more of education gets digitized, there is more data available that tells you about the student learning behaviors and habits. For example, how often students use virtual learning environments, how often they use the library, because most libraries now have electronic swipe cards and electronic checkouts of books. How often so some institutions have attendance monitoring, electronic attendance monitoring for lectures and classes, so how often students attend their classes. And even more so, with more e-books being available, you can also get data on how much of certain textbooks students are reading, things like that. So all this data available, which when combined into complex algorithms, can give you a picture of the extent of a student's engagement with their course and their learning. And this is going to be incredibly powerful for improving student learning over the next few years. And as education gets bigger and more people are in higher education, so the data set gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Are probably limitless, but being able to target student support, to focus educational effort, to understand students' learning journeys and what works for them, what doesn't, to inspire, motivate, and infuse students about their learning is really, really great. And to close attainment gaps, particularly for underprivileged and typically underrepresented groups, particularly Black students, international students, and others. So I'm just going to skip over this and give it. This is what that looks like. And Nottingham Trent University is in particular pioneering this kind of work. In what they create out of all the data that they get from attendance monitoring, from library, from the VLE, from grade and other things, puts together an algorithm, creates an engagement metric. We're actually measuring student engagement in a very real way. And that can be plotted, that can be student view as they are compared to kind of an average rating, which is essentially the minimum required for a good pass grade on the course. And you can see here there's great potential for students to sort of evaluate their progress over the year, and also for tutors to evaluate progress, identify those students who are failing to engage, and to interventions far earlier than would be possible. Slightly less good pictures. If I just go back here, so this student here in this example, the blue line being above the red line is a very strongly performed student because they're well above the average. If we go to this next slide, there we go. Slightly less clear picture, but you can see in this example here, in the top right of the graph, you can see that the blue line is beneath the red, shows a struggling student. The straight yellow line shows the point at which a teacher was able to intervene, seeing that student was leveling off mid that course, and was able to organise an intervention with that student, which led to an upturn in their performance, led to them coming up a bit with the red line, but again their performances sort of flatlined a bit. And this kind of measuring of engagement is going to be incredibly powerful in understanding what motivates and gets students into their learning. What Nottingham Trent have found in piloting learner analytics, probably the most advanced pilot in the UK, is that engagement is one of the best proxies for success, far more than existing features such as demographics. So there's going to be incredible potential here to challenge things like the Black attainment gap, and sort of relative performance of students from more and less privileged backgrounds. So this is really interesting and exciting, and a large part of the sort of in terms of the data sets that this producing of understanding students' engagement with their institutions over time will be really, really important. Question? Sorry. One about surveys and one about analytics. So let me go through those. First question about do any of these surveys ask students if they feel part of a learning community? So the NESI and I believe the engagement survey both do ask questions along those lines. I would need to go back and look at the engagement survey questions. The definitely does ask about extracurricular activities, but the engagement survey I don't think does. I need to double check. So there's a mix. I think in American college systems, actually, they probably are ahead of us in terms of understanding the real value of extracurricular activities. I mean, American colleges are famous for their obsession with things like sport and music, perhaps more so than they are in Britain. So I think that's why perhaps not included on surveys here. I'll have to double check the UK's about whether it asks about other activities, but it definitely asks about learning communities, which has been proven to be really important in terms of student learning. With regards to questions about analytics from Damien, so with not example, the one I've shown you, students have access to these graphs and this data. The person who's sort of overseeing the project at Nottingham Trent says that that, for example, engage in competitions about how engaged they can be and things like that, and sometimes it could be a real spur to motivation, which is quite exciting, and that can be quite good. There are issues which we've been working on here at NUS with JISC, who are currently developing a code of practice on the use of these analytics. I haven't got into sort of the ethics around data use and how to use analytics properly, because that's a very long discussion for another day. But that is something that NUS are involved in discussions with JISC about, in terms of whether interventions mustn't demotivate students, that they mustn't, that you've got to use analytics very carefully in order for them to have a positive effect. But on the whole, if they are used carefully, they can have a very positive effect. In terms of convergence towards the mean, the red line, the course average as presented, is not, and I've understood your question correctly, that the course average as presented is not the average of the students currently on the course. It's like it is done through backdating a load of data, retrospective looking at data to find the minimum needed for a decent pass mark. In terms of whether then there is convergence towards that average in terms of students just doing the bare minimum, I'm not sure. I have to ask Nottingham Trent, but there isn't a sense in which the average of the mean just adjusts during because of depending on that particular cohort student engagement, if that makes sense. If that's not clear, quite a complex area. I haven't properly answered that question. Please do ask it again. But the average isn't an average of the current cohort of students in order to avoid that problem. Excellent. Oh, good. Okay, great. Very quickly, because we have used up all the time, which I'm quite surprised at. Nottingham Trent are definitely ahead of the sector in this, but there are other examples, and I've included at the end of this presentation a document which shows which sort of lists where different institutions are at and sort of developing this, and you can find out more. But particularly interesting examples are the Open University, who obviously have loads of data on what their students are doing because it's all done online. And doing interesting stuff around retention and identifying priority students for support. Edinburgh are going to be something interesting around using this kind of analytics to create personal learning plans. Manchester Metropolitan University are essentially rewriting their entire curricula and digitizing their quality assurance processes and enhancement around an analytics system, which I believe is going to be properly rolled out over the next couple of years. So this is fast expanding and it's going to explode. JISC are currently developing kind of a what they call a freemium solution, which all institutions will be able to use as a basic analytics system with their own VAs and whatever data they have in order to get their analytics going. So it's going to explode over the next few years. It's going to have big, profound implications for student engagement. here the reading, like I've only really been able to touch on most things quite lightly. So if there's anything that hasn't made sense or anything you want to find out more about, I highly recommend reading the HEA report, Making It Count, which is really interesting on the implications of NSS for student engagement and enhancement. UCU have offered a provocative not all online. Yeah, sorry, that was a comment, but there is a great deal of data through the OUs, through the way the OU do things, and they've also led on analytics. It's not just because the data's there. There's I've met the leader of the OU's analytics systems, and really good and really interesting. They're also reflecting on the sort of the ethical side of it, which is interesting. UCU provide an interesting sort of counterpoint to sort of NSS and surveys and systems. The HAA have a number of pages on engagement surveying. You can look up their the Foster questions and whether it includes stuff about extracurricular. I also recommend reading Hefke's review of the NSS, which was published just under a year ago, and will show you kind of the direction that Hefke are looking with the NSS. Are there any final questions? Just to finish up. If they come to your mind afterwards, then just send a mail. She'll forward it on to me. Great. In which case, I'll hand you back to Amelia.
Yeah. Guys, so I hope you enjoyed that. There was a lot of information in there, but I will send out the presentation and the recording if you ever want to go back to it, and some of the other people couldn't make it to today's session. So we'll hang around for a few minutes more, and we'll turn the webcam off now. So if you do have any more questions, we will answer them for you. But if not, thank you very much for coming along, and I will see you on Friday. The final online discussion at 3:30. Okay, so as I said, we'll hang around for a few minutes more if you do have any more questions. Okay. Here.
So from what I can remember, of the Beyond the Consumer Agenda report, not really mostly focused on the NSS, and a little bit on things like module engagement surveys, and it is kind of things also to the criticisms of things like the Research Excellence Framework, because engagement surveys in Britain at least are really new. And when asked in engagement surveys, that emphasis from my institution, my teachers, to these are the things I've done on my. I haven't seen any kind of explicit criticism. If they go mainstream in the next few years, that might change. But if you read the CU paper, that might have something. But from what I can remember, I don't.